So, in the first reading, we talked about the socialization process teachers undergo to enter the teaching profession, and how, for many of the teachers, the formal process, the constitutive rules to becoming a teacher, the component parts, learning about teaching and student teaching that are required to become a teacher, were looked at critically, and that the thing that was important for teachers was their own experiences as students. So, as adults, much of what was guiding their own teaching is their memories as a student and what they learned after they became school teachers. This means that students who are just like the teachers are more likely to benefit from the teacher strategies, as the teacher strategies are not rooted in professional training and pedagogical practices that they learned about, but in their experiences as children, and in what they've learned when they were immersed in the classroom, initially, after becoming teachers. Now, the power of their earlier experiences are so strong that they limit the effect of the shorter socialization process, that formal socialization process. We see how the power of perceptions are shaping teachers' choices, in the Lordy piece on school teacher. And now what we're doing is going to look at the power of perceptions and the power of statuses, not just about schools, but about school districts, and how those impact students and parents' behaviors and life chances. So now I'm going to ask you to listen to this piece about a schooling experience that happened at two schools, Normandy and Francis Howell. This lecture right now is not going to be a traditional lecture with the piece. I'm going to highlight some things, but more importantly, I'm going to ask you questions to consider as you're listening to the piece. Because though this piece focuses on just two schools, the problem that we all live with, the title of the podcast suggests that what happens at these schools and the issues they face exist across our society. So here's a picture of Normandy High School, the high school whose school district is featured prominently, in this episode. Now, recall that we have an unequal education system that we learned about in conflict theory. And what we're learning about first is Normandy School District, which was under provisional accreditation for 15 years, which basically means that the school district has been identified as a highly problematic school district for a very long time. I'd like to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, like pay attention to what was going on at the school while it was under provisional accreditation. And then it became unaccredited, right? So this is an example of how a rule, a constitutive rule about how the school district works, right? When you have a change of status from provisional, it creates like certain conditions that the students and the families must live under. But when the school district status changes from provisional to unaccredited, that's a constitutive rule change, where now, because it's unaccredited, the children and the parents who are zoned to attend Normandy School District have a new range of options to choose from regarding how and where their children go to school. Now, later in the episode, we also learned that the status of the school moves from unaccredited to non-accredited, which again has an impact on the children and families that live within the boundaries of the school district and the rules. And then that governs the rules of the education game that shapes the parents and families' behaviors. I want you to pay close attention to what happens under each of those three statuses in terms of the choices that parents have, regarding their child's education. Now, think about the quality of education at Normandy Junior High when Mariah was an 8th grader. And as a parent, what Nidra, the mom, had to do to support her daughter's education. And I want you to think about that, as, again, thinking about, Nidra wanted the best for her child and valued education for her child. And what she had to do and what she tried to do in order to get her daughter access to quality schooling. Now, how did the change in Normandy's accreditation standards shape the behavior of Mariah's mom? Now, then what I want you to notice is how the changes to the school status shaped Mariah's educational experience. How did the unaccredited status affect the children who stayed at Normandy? The other thing I want you to think about is how being under provisional accreditation affected the students who were there up until that point of time, because again, the provisional accreditation was in place for 15 years. Now we know Mariah's mom chose to send Mariah to Francis Howell. Here's a picture of the school campus. And again, I want you to think about the choices that were made in terms of which school the Normandy children could attend as a result of their unaccreditation. Oops. Okay. So this is the parent meeting that was held when the school was informed that they would have to accept students from Normandy. I don't know if you or your parents ever went to a PTA meeting in high school, but I can guarantee you they did not look like this. One strategy at my own daughter's school that was employed to try to increase parent participation was to hold parent meetings right before a student event would take place, because otherwise parents just didn't show up to meetings. So the possibility of kids from Normandy, the possibility that kids from Normandy would go to Francis Howell really elicited a huge reaction from the community members whose kids attended Francis Howell. And so I want you to pay attention to that too. Now, think about the reaction, think about in this symbolic interactionism lecture, I talked about how actions and people responding to stimuli actually have like a 4-point process. And I want us to think about the parents at the parent-teacher meeting that I showed you in the previous slide. I want you to think about that process of reaction to stimulus, right? So first is the impulse, the immediate stimulation, which in this case is the news that the Normandy children would be attending the Francis Howell High School. So the news that the children would be attending, the news that the Normandy children would be attending Francis Howell was the stimulus, right? And so the parents are going to have a reaction. Now, Normandy students coming to Francis, right, in symbolic interactionism lecture, we talked about how the context matters. So I want you to think about the perception, the thoughts and the assessments of the stimulus, how the Francis Howell parents reacted to the news. Recall that Francis Howell is an affluent school with great resources and scores, and Normandy is the school that had such abysmal metrics that the kids were allowed to leave the school district. So again, like Normandy students are not being evaluated in and of themselves. The fact that they're attached to Normandy School District and how that Normandy School District is loaded with a whole bunch of meanings and perceptions is actually what the parents at Francis Howell are reacting to. Now, next is the manipulation, the pause before taking action. And here's where, parents are having to decide what they're going to do in response to this information. And so then the final step is consummation, taking action that responds to the initial impulse. And so many parents made the decision to attend the school board meeting to learn about the Normandy students coming to their campus, but there were also some parents who decided to share their perceptions and their positions with the school board. Now, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the journalist, points out that parents' comments at the school board meeting varied by race. And so I want you to think about that. I want you to pay attention to what the people were saying. Now, how did the parents' comments differ? Nidra, how did Nidra see the Francis Howell? How did Nidra see Francis Howell? And the the idea that her daughter would be able to go to that school? And then how did Nidra process what she was experiencing while attending the parent meeting? And then I also want you to think about Mariah's experience there too, because remember that she also decided to go to the school board meeting with her mom. And so again, I want you to think about the different groups that are responding to the news that Normandy students were coming to Francis Howell. So you have the Francis Howell parents, you have the Normandy parents, and then you have Mariah, who's kind of like, you can think of her as like a representative of the students that are coming from Normandy. And then I also want you to think about what these reactions say about our education system from a functionalist perspective, but also from a conflict theory perspective, because we can look at this from both perspectives. Now, ask yourself, what does Normandy as a school district represent to the Francis Howell parents? What does Francis Howell School represent to the Normandy parents? And then what comments help you to come to that conclusion? And then how do the parents' comments reflect broader inequalities that exist across our society? And then I also want you to think about how the school responds to the students coming to Francis Howell, right? Because the podcast takes you to the parent teacher meeting, but then the podcast actually also talks about that first day of school when Mariah is on the school bus and coming up to the school. And I want you to think about how the school, basically the choices that the school made in preparation for the Normandy students to come to the, or when they were, coming to the school on the first day of classes. There were cheerleaders that were at the front of at the front of the school when the bus arrives. Why do you think the educators chose to have the cheerleaders at the front of the school when the children arrived? Did the cheerleaders at the front of the school have an effect the way Mariah felt about attending Francis Howell? And now I want you to think about that in contrast to what her experience was at the parent teacher meeting. So again, like even the cheerleaders and the things that they were doing and the meaning that we attach to cheerleaders helps to shape people's experiences, right, with the school. And so I want you to think about that, not just for Mariah, but for like the entire a student population, the parents who are witnessing the cheerleaders welcome basically the students to campus. Okay. Now I also want you to think about, because Mariah was front and center, Mariah and her mom were front and center in this podcast, but we also get an interview with another student, Rihanna Curtin. And I want you to think about and compare, contrast her experience with the Mariah's experience. And I want you to think about how the realities outside of Francis Howell affected Rihanna's behavior and interactions inside the school and with other students. So again, like that, the meaning of Normandy students, right? All of the social constructs that are associated with Normandy, and how Rihanna is navigating that stuff, and as are the students that Rihanna's interacting with. So again, pay attention to that. And then finally, we also get the reporter, Elisa Crouch, spending time with the Normandy senior, Cameron Hensley. And so again, I want you to do two things here. I want you to think about Cameron as Cameron's presented to the podcast audience. And then I would like you to summarize Elisa and Cameron's day at the Normandy High School. Now, based on the observations reported by Elisa and by Nidra, Mariah, Rihanna, and Cameron's experiences, which school gives kids better odds at being successful and why? And then finally, I want you to think about the differences in Mariah, Rihanna, and Cameron's educational experiences. How do the differences in their individual stories help you to understand why we see the persistence of inequality? I want you to think about both structure and agency. How does the social organization of schooling impact students' educational opportunities? But I also want you to think about what the state chose to do in changing Normandy's status from unaccredited to non-accredited, right? Again, that's a constitutive rule. This rule has a rippling effect and actually guides parents and children's behavior. How does that impact going from unaccredited to non-accredited have an impact on children's life chances? And then I want you to think about who is served by the change in the accreditation status, right? So again, these are changes that are happening outside of the control of regular people, but are still having an impact on regular people's life chances. So I hope you listen closely to this piece. It's an amazing piece. Yeah, stop right there.